in Space.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Today in Space. We're here. This is going to be our second to last episode before the end of the year. So we're doing a lot of thinking back and looking at what our last year entailed and what we did well, what we didn't do well, how we can improve. And it's an interesting time. It's funny. I really love doing this podcast. It's a great place for me to grow and to become a better person. But just like anything else, I'm a human being. I have insecurities. I have, it's not all just, numbers on a piece of paper and, I'm a robot about it. I experience growth myself. And what I've really been looking at this last year is trying to take everything with a grain of salt and be grateful for what I have in front of me. We have people listening to this podcast and giving feedback and getting involved, and the community is starting to grow, and it's incredible. I mean, to see how far it's come from the early days of doing this podcast in my basement to where it's come now is really important. But more importantly, it's to look back. That's what this end of this year, 2019, is for me, is to look back at where we've come from and to just be happy about where we're at. I really am grateful for where we're at. I'm grateful for you that listen and watch to the show. So very, very appreciative of that. And I'm really excited about what we have planned upcoming for 2020. First of all, I can't believe we're in 2020 already. That seems like we should have, 2020 growing up was such a crazy year of the future, and we don't have flying cars, and we're not living in space necessarily, but all those little things that are about to get us there are kind of in motion at the moment, and there's a lot to look forward to. Along the way, things are going to get bumpy, and we saw that with the Boeing Starliner test. We saw that, even during the launch process, even when things seem, launching the rocket, launching the spacecraft off the rocket, everything can seemingly go well, but you have to look at the entire mission and not just the launch process. And so we saw that something did go wrong, and the Boeing Starliner spacecraft did not make it to the orbit it needed to get to then get itself to be able to dock with the International Space Station. Now, while many people were very quick to say that this is a problem, that they failed, it was a bump in the road. And if you only looked at that one part of the mission, that one area of, the spacecraft didn't make it to orbit, you could easily consider that a failure. But if you look at the entirety of the mission, the launch went well. The United Launch Alliance did everything they were supposed to do as a launch provider. They delivered the spacecraft to the orbit it was supposed to be in. It was the spacecraft itself that wasn't able to take itself into orbit because of an issue apparently with the mission clock. It didn't know when exactly it was in the mission, and from what I've seen from really preliminary stuff, there's not a report yet. We'll cover that when that comes back out, but basically it didn't know where it was over adjusting, and then by the time it was able to change what was going on, because there was no one on board, which if there was someone on board, they could have easily or more easily adjusted the spacecraft to get into orbit. But because it was a robotic mission and we were trying to do testing, it overworked itself and lost the opportunity to get into orbit. Now, even though that did not go according to plan, the spacecraft landed successfully. The spacecraft was able to put itself into an orbit that was nice and slow and gradual, so that it could deliver the spacecraft to land in the White Sands base to be recovered, and all 3 parachutes were released. And if there were astronauts on board, they would have come home safely. So, look, it's all about your perspective, and this is something I learned. I say a lot of stuff on this podcast. Sometimes, and it's interesting learning more about how people are see or what's the word I'm looking for? I may say it in a certain way in my head, and then there's the way that people take it. And what I've been learning is that sometimes when I say things, it may come across as if it's a definite. And I talk about a lot of things sometimes, like perspective and making sure you have a good perspective, and things like, hey, we've talked a lot about the balance. These are things that I'm working through, and one of the things I'm definitely working through and working on, because this podcast has been such a great growth for me personally, is taking the time to say, hey, let's take a step back, take a deep breath, and what is the big picture? What do we take away from this at the end of it? And what we take away with this Boeing launch is that even though things went wrong, the spacecraft, and if there were people on board, humans on board, they would have been safe. That is a success, and even NASA is considering this not a failure. It didn't actually have to dock with the International Space Station. We learned that after the fact, but apparently that was not required for NASA to consider this a successful test. So it's really about how you want to look at things that determines your entire world view, and it's something that I've definitely thought about, and I've learned throughout the process of this podcast from 5 years ago, which is crazy to think about. But life and how you look at life, the latest metaphor I'm working with is it's like a kaleidoscope, right? Where you would be able to flip different colors, right? And almost like it's a different filter. You could go from being happy to sad to angry to, there's so many different ways you can look at it. But if you can learn to understand that the world, how you view it, totally affects how you see reality, then you can get better at saying, I'm looking at it this way. Maybe I need to take a step back, take a breath, and look at it this way. And it changes your whole perspective on life and the reality that you're living in right now. So what we're doing here at the end of the year is looking at reality. We're looking at the numbers. We're looking at what was popular, what people were actually following the show for and listening to and liked the most. We're going to have a top 10 list on the website at todayinspace.net, so you can check that out and see what people were most interested in this year. And we're focusing next year to start talking about those things and to expand in ways that we've never done before, because I've gotten to, I feel like I've done enough work to get to the next level to now start trying out new things. We talk about, the show is Today in Space, which is a very broad term, and we talk a lot about rockets and the rocket industry because that is the vehicle that will allow us to go into space. All these future sci-fi things can't happen unless we're able to go into space economically, and that's one of the big things that SpaceX has kind of broken the space industry for, is that it is possible to have reusable spacecraft, and it is possible that can really drop the price and make things super competitive and will explode the space industry. But now we're going to start expanding into what's possible and other things of space and really expanding what we're going to talk about here. So I'm very excited about that. We'll talk about that more as we get into 2020. But very, very excited. There's a lot to come, and that's it. So for the rest of this episode, we're going to finish up with part 2 of the Veggie Lab. One of the great things about 2019 was we got to go to the NASAsocial down in Florida to cover the SpaceX CRS-19 launch, which was my first rocket launch of all time. If you haven't seen them, please, those videos are up there. I've got a lot of feedback that people could literally tell how excited I was, and I was above the moon. It was crazy. It was such an experience. So go check those out. But this is going to be our last little portion of basically taking you on the tour with us. So this is part 2 of the Veggie Lab, and this is a laboratory where they test out and experiment on how to grow things in space. If we do achieve the goal of going into space, how do we feed the humans that are out there? How do we give them enough nutrients to do that? And the first part we talked about last week with Rolf Ritchie. He was talking about how to actually build the infrastructure and what we need to do for nutrients. What plants do we have to grow? And in this section, we're going to talk about the science that goes into actually breaking down what it's like to plant and to grow each of these plants, and the science that goes into comparing on Earth and on the space station how to test those things so that we make the best use of our time, because they don't have that many that many tries. It's really hard to get onto a rocket launch and to deliver something into space. And so if we're able to actually build an experiment and get every bit of data through a limited amount of experiments, that's the way they have to do it. And so they talk a little bit about that. But more importantly, it's just interesting to hear from the people that are involved. I mean, these people took time out of their day. They're involved in the day-to-day operations of making this stuff happen. And they set up this tour and spent the time to gather their thoughts and to talk about it. And I thought they all did a great job. I mean, it's definitely something, if you're an engineering student, there's definitely some of those times where your professor is a very brilliant person, but isn't very good at communicating that. And all these people here were great at communicating the science and what they're doing. So without further ado, that's what we're going to have for this week. Thank you for following us. 2020 has so much amazing stuff coming forward for us, and I'm looking forward to it. If you have any ideas, or you want to reach out, or you want to just talk space, we're on Instagram and Twitter at Today in Space Pod. We're on Facebook at Today in Space Podcast, and we're also on TikTok at Today in Space. So you can check us out on all those platforms. That's it, folks. Have a great end of your year. I hope you had a great holiday season. Stay well, and we'll be back before the end of the year with a little 2020 pre-show for the next year. All right. See you next time. Enjoy the rest of this show.